So I want to look at Galatians 6:2, a very popular Bible verse, but also Galatians 6:5, far less popular. Galatians 6:2 says, share each other's burdens, and in this way obey the law of Christ. Then we look at verse 5, and it says, for we are each responsible for our own conduct. And actually, if you just back up to verse 4, it says, pay attention to your own business. So what's the deal here? These two verses on the surface seem to be sending mixed messages, right? But look, I don't think Paul is confused. He's actually being very intentional in his message and in the words he's using. What helps is if we look at those words in their original language and determine, what do they mean? When he talks about burdens, he's talking about something that's very crushing to the emotions, to the soul of a person, something too heavy for one person to carry alone. You can think grief or loss or crisis or deep suffering here. But when he talks about that load in verse 5, he's talking about something like a personal pack, something that each person is responsible to carry for themselves. In this situation, we could think about responsibilities, choices, and habits, even consequences of our actions. These are personal responsibilities. So the Bible isn't telling us to carry everything. It's telling us to carry the right things. And this is where the story of Jesus at the wedding of Cana from our sermon on Sunday helps us out a lot. Jesus noticed the problem. He cared about the problem, but he didn't immediately take ownership of the problem. And that shows us something that should be very freeing to us. Awareness does not equal assignment from God in our life. A lot of us are tired because we treat every load that we see in other people like a burden that we must carry. And we carry things that God never asked us to carry. So here's a very helpful question. As you go into this week and ask this question, is this overwhelming them? This problem, this struggle they're going through? Or is this something that they are responsible for? If it's overwhelming, that's a burden. If it's responsibility, that's a load. You can still care, you can still pray, you can still support, but you don't have to take ownership of what God hasn't assigned to you. This week, just pause long enough to ask that one question. It might be the difference between walking with compassion and living under guilt-driven faith. Okay, we are continuing our short series on Is This My Problem? It's based on John chapter 2, Jesus' miracle at the wedding of Cana. In the first part, we talked about loads and burdens, and we looked at Galatians chapter 6. But all this, comes from a desire to help people. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because listen, even when we're helping, we can still cross a line. You can do the right thing in the wrong way. At the wedding in Cana, in verse 3, we see Mary bringing this problem to Jesus, right? She says, hey, they've run out of wine. There's no more wine. And then she does something remarkable in the story. She just walks away, right? She doesn't tell Jesus how to fix it. She doesn't suggest a bunch of things that he can do, right? When to act. She doesn't try to manage the outcome here. She just turns to the servants and she says, hey, whatever he tells you to do, you do it. And then she goes back to the party, right? Guys, that's real trust. And that's where we go wrong a lot of times. Most of us don't just hand things over to God. We hand them over, but we hover. We pray, and then we manage. We help, but we stay anxious. We say we're trusting, but we're really micromanaging things. That's not faith. That's control disguised as responsibility. Jesus doesn't give instructions to Mary here. Don't miss that. He gives instructions to the servants. Now, why? Because Mary's role was never to execute the outcome. It was to release it. Sometimes the most faithful thing that you and I can do in a situation is stop standing between God and what he's trying to do in other people's lives. Helping does not mean controlling. Compassion does not require constant involvement. So here's the question for today. Am I helping or am I trying to control the outcome? If your peace depends on the outcome, then you may have taken ownership of something, or you've taken ownership of something to too far a degree, and God never assigned that to you. So today I want you to choose one situation in your life and do this. I want you to to determine to stop giving advice unless you're asked, stop checking for updates constantly, and stop replaying outcomes in your head, okay? And say this instead: Jesus, I've brought this to you and I'll do what you ask. Nothing more. Mary trusted that Jesus was enough. And so she stepped back. And sometimes that's what faith looks like. Tomorrow in part 3, we're going to talk about why rescuing too quickly can actually slow down God's work. And so I hope that you'll tune in for that as well.